Amazon is going to be flooded with requests, with orders for all kinds of books we should have read and perhaps haven't. Certainly inspired me. I wonder if people have questions and thoughts that they wish to address to Natalie. Well, no, you can share yours.
Or no one will ask anything, and that'll save it being a problem.
Comments, thoughts, contributions. Over there.
For those of us who may have lapsed in our classical training or have none, what do you think would be the best guide for getting into classics? What would be our syllabus?
Well, I would hesitate to say The Ancient Guide to Modern Life by me, because that seems childish. So I'll content myself to answering what looked really like a very loaded question by saying I tried to write a book which was a good overview of politics and law and culture and social history and living in the town and living in and all those things, and money and death and everything. So be my guest, I'll send you one. But if you're going to read a proper book, an ancient book, I am incredibly biased, so I can only give you my favourites, which are read the Aeneid. The Aeneid is beautiful. Only an idiot wouldn't read the Aeneid when they've got a spare 2 hours going. Aeneid 4 is the story of Dido and Aeneas. It is the most beautiful book of poetry ever written. Ever, 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 ever. If you're going to read Greek tragedy, then you should read Euripides' Medea, because it is awesome. And that's one of the things that made me a classicist. I saw Diana Rigg play her when I was about 16, or maybe 17, and I thought I would never recover. I saw her at the Almeida because my dad had a crush on her when she was in The Avengers. And I was like, Dad, let's go and see a Greek play, it'll be brilliant, it's got that lady, and you like, So I go for that. Read Juvenal. Juvenal is awesome. All of Juvenal is awesome all the time. So yay, and go Juvenal. If you want some general gossip on ancient Rome, he's a good place to start, as is Suetonius. Graves translated Suetonius. That's where all the gossip in I Claudius comes from. So our version of Claudius, as for want of a better phrase, Derek Jacobi, is largely from Suetonius. But any time you want to know who might have had sex with something deviant, Suetonius is the place to go, every single time. I wouldn't lie to you.
So what got you going on this? I mean, after all, most people of your generation, even my generation, maybe had to learn a little bit, but not much, and we've had very little contact with it, really. So what was it that fired you in the beginning?
I guess I was lucky and I had good teachers, which is, I think, pretty much always the answer for people when they have a passion for anything. Somewhere in their background is somebody who was just better than other teachers, and I had that. And last year I got to go and give the prizes out at my old school, clinching proof that I am now both old and respectable, two things I never thought would happen. And I hijacked that. He's still there and he was retiring. I hijacked their speech day to tell him that he had completely changed my life, and I made everyone cry, and it was brilliant. Because at heart I am, of course, both childish and competitive, something they couldn't fix. So, no, I was lucky. I had a really good Latin teacher, I had a really good Greek teacher, and then when I got to 16, I thought, this isn't enough classics. Ancient history for me as well, please. And then luckily, when I went, this is exactly the kind of story that people tell about Oxbridge interviews, so please do take it in the terms of being both true but also a good thing. I turned up for my interview at Cambridge, and I was really frightened because the girl who came out of their office before me, and she was crying. And I was like, oh good, this is how I was hoping this was going to go. Marvellous. And you hear all those rumours where somebody says, they make you throw a brick through a window and then tell you off, and you, what? Why would anyone do that? That would be demented. But you're 17 or 18 and you believe it. And this girl came out in tears, and I said, are you all right? Were they mean to you? And she went, no, they were really nice. I was like, okay, that's much worse than I was thinking. And she said, they made me translate Virgil unseen. And I thought, I've got a hope in hell. Boy, is that not going to work out. And I walked into the office, and the man who became my director of studies, the unbelievably wise and brilliant Professor David Sedley, said, Natalie Haynes. And I was like, yes. And he went, I've been looking forward to meeting you so I could ask you, and flipped through my UCAS form. And he went, UCA form, I guess, in those days. Flipped through it and went, how do you keep a 1959 Morris Thousand saloon on the road? I was like, car maintenance, I can totally do that, come on. And so I think he let me in because I knew how to fix an old car, and he thought that showed a sort of pleasing attitude to the ancient world. But I don't recommend that people buy cars in order, I'm just saying that because if this goes out on the net, I don't want everyone to go, oh, I need to buy an old car to get in. You don't. It does help.
To learn Latin and Greek well enough to read these things in the original, to appreciate the poetry and the wit, that's harder graft than most people do at school these days.
See, you say that, but actually I think it is easier sometimes to get jokes in a second language. I am so bad at getting puns that my family, including my brother is here today, so he can back me up on this. For many years, my family used to refer to me as Natalie Sunkissed Haynes, because I didn't realise for a really long time that the orange drink Sunkissed was a pun, because it's spelled differently, so it just didn't occur to me that it was. I'm quite slow on the pun uptake, and my boyfriend is like King Pun. All the chapter titles in the book, which are funny, are his, including, most brilliantly, the one on women, which is called Frankly, My Dear, I Don't Give a Damn. Come on! And every time I go and give a talk about the book, they go, oh, the chapter titles are brilliant. And I just have to sit there going, I didn't do those. I'm really sorry. It's mortifying. So I think it's easier to get puns in a second language because you're trying harder to understand it. You're expecting there to be subtext and double meanings and things, whereas in your first language, I'm never paying that much attention.
You do get the feeling now that, you started off by saying this, that politicians are extraordinarily ignorant of history, both recent but particularly of classical history. But they don't any longer, not since he not power. It's probably the last one.
And Boris Johnson,
Boris Johnson.
Classicist, I'm sorry to report.
Ah, that's true. That's true. Well, what about that? Has that made him a better leader of men as a result?
Well, think what he'd be like if he hadn't read. And this is sort of one of the unseen consequences of having a government almost entirely made up of people who went to Eton. Latin is still compulsory there, so at least they have got a bit of Virgil underneath their cold
all
hearts.
Of those Italians on the front bench, and you don't get the sense that any of them have a grounding of that sort of depth.
It's disappointing, isn't it? They should be trying a little harder, I would suggest. But there you go, that's what happens when people go from PR into politics.
Right, now, anybody else want to... somebody here in the front, and then we'll take woman over there next.
Thank you. Hello, I'm Peter. Stop me if you want me to stop, because I'm going slightly off the track here. But when you started your talk, you began by saying that in order to get a grounding and understanding of who we are, we need to go back in time to make these connections with what we still call the ancient world. To me, it's not the ancient world, because it's only a few thousand years ago. We've been around for much longer than that. There's a much more ancient world which we have largely lost touch with. It is recoverable. But the thing is that a conversation began in the 19th century amongst anthropologists. Then it was stamped on. Said this conversation will not continue. It has re-emerged towards the end of the last century, and the beginning of this, and it is around the notion that in our prehistory, the world was matriarchal, and it was run by women, and the descent was through the female line, and that goes back 100 and whatever thousand years. That is a long, long history which we've lost. Well, as I say, it is not entirely lost. But what happens is there is a period which I call proto-civilization, which was sort of like synonymous with the sort of Proto-Indo-European language period, where this whole thing was overturned. In other words, the matriarchal kinship system, which lasted thousands and thousands of years, tens of thousands of years, was utterly overturned and crushed in order to make way for this newfangled thing called marriage, where women were torn away from their female kin and given to this male person to do what they like with.
So there was an Eden that we lost.
So Eden was a time, not a place. And I suspect, I don't know, but I suspect that Lysistrata owes as much to folk memory as to anything else. He's actually describing that pre-civilized world.
The time of Lilith.
Well, yeah, I mean...
Still my favourite of Fraser's
I'll stop
wives.
there, but...
What do you think? What?
I would love that to be true. I think that's a really lovely thought, that folk memory was inspiring writers for such a long time. And I think certainly we get the sense from, say, the plays of Aeschylus or Euripides, that they are reworking earlier stories, that the Trojan War or the Labours of Hercules get reworked and become different and gradually narrower. And you even get pastiches of those within Aristophanes in, I think, the Thesmophoria Zuzai, easily one of the nicest words to say, incidentally. I can't recommend it enough. But I think you then, when he parodies the idea of Euripides' stories as well, so I think you must be right. How can these stories just disappear? They don't ever seem to. There are, is it Christopher Booker who wrote 7 Basic Plots? Anyone? Man, it's like you all watched telly for a year before you came here and didn't do any research for me. Jeez. Lazy. I think it is Christopher Booker who points out that the plot of Jaws and the plot of Beowulf are the same, that it's all about overcoming the monster. And so, yeah, I think absolutely those archetypal stories of and archetypes of people and their relationships with each other, absolutely, I think they must have been used and reused by poets and playwrights over and over again.
There was someone then... But yes.
I've got a comment and a question. Comment was, Polly, you said, you have to get a good knowledge of Latin and Greek to appreciate this stuff. You can do it without that. I teach sixth form classical civilization at A-level. They don't have a word of Latin or Greek before I get at them. But even though our government is supposedly full of people who did Latin, what can we do to make these Philistines put classical studies into the national curriculum, or let them learn it before they get to the sixth form?
Pit them against each other in gladiatorial battle.
Oh,
that's what I would suggest.
That was my comment, really. The comment was about that, and the question was how can we get them to understand that studying Juvenal... I teach them all in English, I teach them about women, I teach them Greek tragedy, they love it, and they can see the relevance to today. So why can't any of our rulers...
It's lucky you're teaching them Juvenal in English, because when I was at school, we did Juvenal, and the Latin is so filthy that it isn't in your the Collins little gem. And then, so you go to the next dictionary up, which I think for me is Lewis and Short, is that right? Lewis and Clark? Can't remember. Thank you. And you look it up, and it's not there. And so you go to, for want of a better phrase, the big dictionary, and you look it up there, and it gives you the Greek, and you go... okay, my Greek isn't that good. And then you go and find the equivalent Greek dictionary, and it gives you the Latin. And you go, I don't know where his hand is, but it isn't as bad as I'm imagining. Just tell me what it says. So, well done for getting to teach them any Juvenal at all. I think I had to be about 20 before I was allowed any of it.
It's only a part of sixth satire.
Probably for the
best. We do a topic on...
Very, very
Do you teach it unbowdlerised? Is it nowadays?
Sorry?
Do you teach it unbowdlerised?
Oh, I do, but their problem is that they don't have very good vocabularies these days, and the translations we have to use, are a little bit old-fashioned. So I spend my whole life explaining what words like strumpet and other, even more obvious. I tend to show them what a hyacinth was the other day. We were talking about Odysseus' hair looking like a hyacinth. And they do have very poor vocabulary, so it is a bit of a problem. And we also spend the first 3 weeks of the course discussing prostitution and adultery, which I wonder what they're telling their parents when they go home. But as I said, they do love it, and I have 40 doing AS and 14 doing A2. It's interstate sixth form college. So we are there somewhere.
I think maybe that is the slightly reassuring thing, that I get quite a lot of letters from people who are, my age or older, saying, I like this book, I really like classics, I like this, or whatever. And then occasionally I get letters from students who obviously studied classics sort of against their parents' better judgment, saying, finally, I can now explain to my parents why I do this. And that is a lovely moment. And I think things like Minimus, the Little Mouse Latin books for small children, have meant that children get a go on Latin a little sooner. Long ago, before he became very successful, I did badger Michael Gove about Latin on the curriculum when we used to do what was then Newsnight Review together. And he said he'd have to get modern languages back before he could do ancient ones, something which I don't entirely agree with, I've got to be honest. But that is because I think people often forget that Latin is comparatively a very easy language to learn. So if you are nervous of other languages, I genuinely believe we are, as a nation, not bad at languages. We're just really shy and we don't want to get things wrong, and we live in constant fear of going to, say, Paris and doing our best French and then being given the baleful eye by a waiter. And so we stop trying because we get frightened. And actually, you never have to go to ancient Rome and say anything. So Latin is much better.
Yes, so over there.
Yeah, I'm really interested in kind of how far you can take these things back. Because in almost all writing around the world, it seems that as soon as you have civilization, the people seem very much like ourselves. They moan about the equivalent of people parking in front of their houses, and they think that the younger generation are useless and that they're using their traditions. And it just feels exactly the same. But there are lots of runners that have talked about it. You don't have to go much past that before people's lives seem almost impossible for us to understand. Their lives are so transient and so violent, and they're so superstitious, and you don't have to go far before that kind of like what we, I guess, think of as civilization, that people's lives become very difficult for us to kind of draw any parallels to. It's so hard for us to understand. What do you think is the difference? What is that kind of sort of magic moment where suddenly they just feel so much like us, whereas suddenly before they just feel their lives feel impossible for us to understand?
I think probably it's to do with documentation. I think it's to do with how much writing there is. I talk a lot about the idea of it not mattering that you're illiterate in, for example, ancient Rome or ancient Athens, because if everyone isn't literate, society isn't predicated on literacy, then a man's word is his bond. It's why it's such a shocking moment in the Hippolytus, where Hippolytus says he makes a promise not to say something, or the nurse gets a promise from her, and then he says, I'm going to go and tell somebody, and she says, but you promised, and he says, my tongue swore, but my mind was unsworn. And it's a quote that Aristophanes is always throwing back at Euripides. Whenever he parodies Euripides, that's the quote he uses, because in a society where people didn't write down contracts and sign them, a man's word was incredibly important. You can't possibly say one thing and mean another. It's terrifying. And so I think once we get people writing about their own experiences, when Thucydides writes even his driest descriptions of battles, we're reading about a man who was a general during these wars. We're reading about a man who had and survived the plague which killed so many people. And so suddenly we feel like we're inside looking out, as opposed to outside looking at just lists of names of people who died, or why they might have died. And so as soon as we have writing, lots of writing, then I think we feel more connected to a society. When you read someone's love poetry, when you read Catullus, who is superstitious too, saying that he wants to give his mistress this many kisses and then this many thousand, he's trying to stop somebody being able to put the evil eye on them by giving it a number that's limitless that people can't guess. So they can't go, the 115th kiss, you'll be stricken dead. He is incredibly superstitious, but how can we not know how he feels? We've all been in love, or at least I like to think we've all been in love. So instantly we're drawn into that society. Once we can see that those people experience the same emotions as us, I think that is, even if someone's life is nasty, brutish and short, it's the emotional sincerity maybe that makes us feel like we belong to them and they belong to us.
The religious aspect of life seems particularly puzzling to us now. The idea of the gods on Olympus and how they behaved, and I find that particularly difficult to either to believe that they believed it. The serious writers, serious thinkers, did they actually believe it? Was it just a metaphor? But they seem to have believed it. And it's a curious kind of religion. All religions are very curious for those of us who are not religious, but particularly difficult one, I think, for us to reimagine how people thought then.
Well, I guess I would say that it's kind of hard to know how much people believed it and how much it's metaphor. There is no language in, for example, ancient Athens for psychological conditions. at all. And so when you get a play like the Hippolytus, we have Artemis, chastity, self-denial and so on one side, and then we have Aphrodite, lust, sex, getting what you want on the other. And these two goddesses basically do war across and through the person of Hippolytus. Hippolytus is too refusing sex, so Aphrodite must punish him because he's scorned her. And we read it, and we can go, oh, okay, well, this is meaningless. These gods are so petty. They are like uber-powerful toddlers, basically, with an endless shelf life. They have no sense of morality other than what they want. And so, it is tempting to go, well, Euripides can't have thought that they were worth worshipping. But another way of reading it, and people do, is, well, if you don't have a language for saying, well, I want this, but I can't have it, and the psychological condition of going, well, my superego is overruling my id at the moment, then gods isn't the worst way of doing it. And also, I wrote this in the book, and I felt like when I was writing it, I was being slightly arch, and actually, I'm not being arch, I genuinely think this. I think if you are religious or superstitious, it becomes very easy to feel slightly outmaneuvered by the bigness of what's going on. And if you are suffering a small scale, but to you, vital personal trauma, and at the same time, tsunami has just hit Japan, it becomes very easy to think, oh, well, I can't pray for the boy to call me, because then I feel frivolous and not like a proper world citizen. Actually, if you divide things up, it kind of feels better. You should be able to say, it's very important that a boy calls me. I will pray to Aphrodite, or Eros, or Cupid, or whatever you want to call them. I will pray to these gods of love, and that will be fine. And then simultaneously, I will make an offering to Poseidon / Neptune, and say, please stop having earthquakes and the sea. And that will be, that's my bit for that. So I think there's something to be said for division of labour. I also think the idea of Zeus as being just incredibly promiscuous. It seems to me like, he's always turning up and impregnating somebody as a swan or a shower of rain, or, in the Amphitrio play, I absolutely loathe by Plautus. He turns up as Amphitrio. Amphitrio is away fighting a war, he's a general, and Jupiter, for it is Roman now, turns up and pretends to be him in order to have sex with Alcmena, Amphitrio's wife, and that is what creates Hercules. And you think, well, see, it sounds like spurious religiosity, and yet, if men were away at war, and sometimes children were conceived while they were away, a god did it. Seems to me like an excellent...
That comes into the Christian faith.
Well, a little, in every faith, pretty much, there's a virgin birth, or somebody who's rebuilt. Osiris, obviously in Egyptian mythology, is sort of rebuilt after his death by Isis and comes back to life. So, and Bacchus as well, I think, we have these sort of ideas of a god being born of a god. So it's not just Christianity that goes crazy for that.
The other advantage of that particular religion is that it doesn't require an all-seeing, all-good God. It's a better explanation when terrible things happen.
Absolutely.
Christianity has no explanation for why terrible things happen. But here, jealous, badly behaved, warring gods or furies that pursue you for reasons that may or may not be your fault is a much better reason.
It is, and if, in a way, it's not. I don't think it's particularly irrational. If you live in a world where people cannot possibly know what tectonic plates are and that they clash, then assuming you have angered a god is not the stupidest thing anyone could possibly think. That seems pretty reasonable to me. And, even we find the ancients questioning it. Somebody says is it the clouds? I think it is the clouds, but I may be wrong, so don't quote me. Somebody says, well, you believe in all these gods. No, wait, do you know what? It's in the Euthyphro. It's in Plato's Euthyphro. Somebody says, well, I guess it's probably Socrates, Natalie, because, it's Plato. He says, well, here's the thing. You believe that, what the gods love is pious, but is that what some of the gods love or what all of the gods love? And what about, if one god likes somebody and another one doesn't? Hera is a big fan of this person fighting in the Trojan War, and, Aphrodite is their enemy. And so, which one is the right one? And if Zeus is punishing you with thunderbolts, then why does sometimes his own temples get struck by thunder? When he says in the clouds, somebody says, I can't remember the man's name. He says, "Oh well, Zeus has to strike down people who commit perjury." And Socrates in the play says, "Well, when's the last time an oak tree committed perjury?" And they get struck by lightning too. So they did question it, I think.
Right. One there, and then take somebody there.
I'm a big fan of the ancient Greeks myself, but I think that maybe we pay so much attention to the Greeks and the Romans is because they wrote those things down in a very entertaining and amusing sort of way. As the gentleman over there was saying, for most of our history, we have actually been a hunter-gatherer people, and this is our evolutionary heritage. The way that the ancient Greeks are describing the world is a set of people like us who have discovered agriculture and large standing armies and so on. And the reason that we keep getting into such a mess and having wars all the time is because of our evolutionary heritage. Do you think maybe we ought to be going a bit further back into our history and examining that a lot more than the ancient Greeks?
You're never going to hear me arguing against reading more books and trying harder to understand the past. So, yes, I do. Of course I do. I think every effort to understand a civilization which isn't ours, however different or however similar, is time we're spending learning about who we are and how we interact with other people. And it seems to me like such a huge double whammy. You get to learn about a new society, objectively new knowledge, interesting, and you get to learn more about yourself. So, yes, of course.
Somebody over there.
First of all, thank you very much for a really interesting and enlightening talk. It was great. As a teenage boy, I studied Latin, and I enjoyed it. I enjoyed Caesar's Gallic Wars because it seemed relevant. I could understand Gallius, Omnis Divisa, and Partes Tres, so on. Virgil I loved too, the Aeneid, but it was hard going. All these long epic similes, by the time you've translated them, you've lost the thread of the narrative. But what no one taught, and I hope they teach it now, was Catullus. When I discovered Catullus when I was 19 or 20, it was just fantastic in all respects. I mean, the love poetry, Dam Mihi, Millebasia, and Lesbia Sparrow, and so on, and all the rude bits and so on. We didn't do any of that in school, but for teenage boys, it would have been really motivating. Do they do it now?
I got to do it at school, and we had the one word, Lesbia Sparrow, is sickening, and my best friend at school, as my Latin teacher, God love him, struggled to say tactfully, this might be sort of some kind of metaphor for sort of something else. And she went, is it about him being impotent, Mr. C? Yes, Ros, was his patient answer. So, yeah, I got to do Catullus, but I agree with you. Absolutely, you should. I think there's a secret age at which you should read things, and Catullus is teenage passion and, being overwhelmed by how painful and awful everything is. Of course, all teenagers should read Catullus, because being a teenager is like being Catullus. Whereas, for example, Horace, I think you should probably leave until you're a little older, because when I first read him, I didn't see how desperately romantic a middle-aged man could be, and now I see differently.
But why did a whole, classrooms, particularly perhaps worse for girls, have to struggle through Caesar? Endless fortifications and weird words for tortoises and spikes and ditches and all of that stuff. What was that about?
Shonky teachers is what that was about. Now, you can always pick something good. I'm sure the lady down here who teaches Class Civ will back me up. There are always 2 or 3 options for each paper, and basically you need to pick a paper that your kids will be interested in, or that you think they will be interested in. I had for A-level Aeneid 4, win, and Livy 21, which you kind of go, oh God, Livy, really, with battles and so on. But that's Hannibal taking the elephants over the Alps. And the shaggy, shabby men of the Alps who try to see it, not that I can still remember it or anything, because that'd be weird, trying to help them and then betray them, and then, a huge battle. And there are moments of absolute crushing horror in Livy, at the Battle of Cannae, where he talks, I think that's also in 21, where he talks about these men who've been hurt in this huge day of battle. It's a massively important victory for Rome. They hold Hannibal back by a day, and that's enough in the end to keep Rome Roman. So it's a really big deal. A glorious victory. To have died at Cannae is incredibly respectable. And then Livy tells us about the battlefield the next day, and these injured men having choked themselves to death on the soil because they were so badly hurt and they had so little hope of anyone rescuing them or helping them, that they would rather have simply suffocated then and there than lay there dying slowly of their pain. So sometimes the people who look a little off-putting can reward you with an extraordinary story, even Caesar.
Yes, woman at the side.
Going back to Catullus for a moment, you might be interested to know that there's a very interesting series of part songs by an American composer called James Sellers, and one of the settings is Catullus. Worth looking out for.
I am interested to know that, and thank you.
Behind you.
Like in panto.
The Greeks were, I suppose, what we would call an advanced civilization, and they introduced something totally novel, as far as I know, to the world. I'm curious to know, culturally, where did the Greeks come from? Did it come out of...
How did they get to be...
It couldn't have come out of thin air, surely.
The previous Greeks is the short answer. I mean, I think probably you mean Athens. Is that right? The Athenian experiment is what gives us so much. We don't tend to talk... When we talk about what the Greeks did for us, we almost always mean Athens. We don't very often mean Sparta. Most of us don't want to go and chuck babies off a cliff because they cry. Well, I say that. Many of us would like to chuck babies off a cliff because they cry, but most of us don't consider that an excellent piece of social experimentation. I think the Athenians were just an extraordinary people, and it's really hard to unpick why the Persian wars in the early half of the 5th century were, I suppose, a moment where people crystallized, the Greeks crystallized, and by that I mean also the Spartans, also other bits of Greece, not just Athens, crystallized their opposition to the East. The idea of foreign kings and dubious gods coming in and trying to take over was something which made the Greeks feel, literally, I suppose, and metaphorically, under siege. And I think perhaps that crystallized a very strong idea of Greekness. You know, we are still very happy to talk now about the idea of Blitz spirit, that Britain was at its most British when we were under metaphorical siege. And so perhaps that has something to recommend it, that actually a society which is threatened digs in its heels and becomes more extraordinary than it would have become. But there's no way past it. There's sort of 40 or 50 years where just ludicrously extraordinary things happen in one part of the world, and then it's never repeated again. I don't know. Magic.
Challenge and response, but then a lot of places that are challenged and go under.
Yeah, some people don't respond in the same way, and that's undeniable. And the Greeks questioned their democracy at the same time that they had it. They made terrible mistakes with it. They made brilliant choices with it. And as that was happening, Socrates was walking around challenging people to explain why they were so much smarter than, he thought they were. Sophocles was writing Oedipus Tyrannus, Aeschylus was writing the Oresteia, Euripides was writing the Medea, Aristophanes was producing all that comedy, Plato was a young man learning. It seems impossible that all these people lived in the same place. Even now, to me, it seems impossible.
Well, I think at that we have to end this question and answer session, but thank you very, very much for an absolutely sensational